Hi, welcome to Community Work and to this session in which I would like to demystify the nature of the practice models that can be used in community work and how to use them. This overview is based on the book The Theory and Practice of Community Work, a Southern African Perspective by Mike Weyers. So, let's start with a problem that I would like to address. A lot of social work students and practitioners seem to struggle with the nature of practice models in general, and especially with the so-called practice variables that are used in the demarcation of these models. This is an attempt to demystify the concepts and to explain them as practically possible. The overview will be structured according to the typical questions that both students and practitioners have raised over the years. But first, let's start with a practice scenario we would use as example in the explanation. In our scenario, you have just started to work as a social worker at the Amalgamated Welfare Trust NGO. Your work contracts simply state that you must do community work in Medibaville, a local community. Nothing more, nothing less. So you must now decide what to do next. Let's take the questions step by step from there. The first question that most students and practitioners ask is, so, where do I start? Of course, as a professional, you will start by finding out more about your client system, the community. You will have to find answers to questions such as, exactly where is it situated? What are viewed as its borders? What are the socio-demographic characteristics of the people who live in it? What economic, social, political, spiritual, cultural, educational, biophysiological, etc. systems are found in it, or do the members have access to? What do all the important role plays, for example your organization, the government, community leaders, the community members themselves, etc., view as the community's most important strengths and impediments? In short, you will have to do community analysis or community profile study. Student and practitioners' typical follow-up question will then be, now that I have all the data, what next? Well, you must now decide how to address the impediments that were identified. In other words, what are the unsolved problems, the unfulfilled needs, or the unutilized potential in Medibaville that should receive your professional attention? The usual response to this answer is a question such as, now, which how-to options do I have? Well, communities are very complicated systems, and so are the professional interventions that are required to change or influence them. You will therefore have two basic how-to options. The first is to decide beforehand on the approach that you will follow. It could be asset-based community developments, participatory change, social planning, etc. And then to apply it in all practice settings, including Medibaville. The alternative is to first analyze a practice setting and then decide on the approach that would best fit the findings of this analysis. The practice models basically give you a menu to choose from when you follow the second approach. The next question is then usually, which practice models are available? The community change practice models, or practice models for short, represent the 5 predominant ways in which community work is done in Southern Africa. These ways of doing are community development, social planning, community education, social marketing, and social action. You can choose any one or any combination of these models as your point of departure. The next question will then be, how do practice models work? All practice models are based on a very simple premise or principle. It is, how you define the target community and its impediments would determine how you would change the community. This principle is found throughout professions, be it medicine, psychology, social work, or even engineering. In medicine, for example, it would basically be to assess the patient and diagnose his or her illness, and then use the results to prescribe the most appropriate treatment. In community work, it would, on the other hand, basically be to analyze the community and its context, then assess its impediments, and then use the results to choose the most appropriate plan of action. In order to understand the practice models, you must understand how they are structured. This is where the practice variables enter the picture. The variables are simply the type of things or categories of factors that all community workers encounter in all practice settings, be they working in India, America, or with Medibaville in South Africa. The categories are always the same, but the things, for example, elements, features, factors, perceptions that are found in each category may be different. They may, therefore, vary from one setting to the next. There are especially 12 such categories or types of things, in other words variables, that play an important role in how community work could be done in Southern Africa. I will now briefly look at each and also on how the first three may apply to your findings regarding Medibaville. The first is the dominant perceptions of the nature of the community. In other words, how do people see the system? In the case of Medibaville, you may have found that people see it as a stagnant community in which members are passive, do nothing to improve their own circumstances, or do not work together to make the community a better place to live in, and/or a community that do not receive the social work and other social services that they are entitled to, and/or a community that simply do not know how to or are unwilling to address the impediments that they experience, and/or one that has a negative attitude towards social issues or do not know which services are available to them, and/or a community that is a victim of the people and structures that has power. The second variable deals with assumptions about the factors that have caused the community's impediments. In the case of Medibaville, your answers may have indicated that the impediments have been caused by deficiency in the community itself, such as feelings of powerlessness and apathy, a lack of self-organization, or excessive community discord and conflict, and/or a lack of appropriate services to address the needs and problems that are part and parcel of everyday community life, and/or a lack of knowledge and skills to cope with life's demands, and/or inappropriate attitudes towards impediments, or a lack of knowledge on where and how to access appropriate services, and/or the fact that some community members are the victims of systems that abuses their power. The third variable deals with the individuals or groups in the community who ought to benefit directly from your services. In other words, who your client or consumer system should be. In the case of Medibaville, you may have found from your research that it should be the entire community or at least a large proportion of its members, and/or only the dysfunctional or needy members of the community, and/or only the members that need further education and training, and/or the actual or potential consumers of social work services, and/or the victims of the abuse of power. The findings based on the first three variables should give you a pretty good idea on how the other variables would manifest themselves in your particular practice setting. It would indicate which level you will have to work in order to effect the required change, the type of goals or outcomes that you will have to pursue, the objectives that should be linked to these goals, the strategy that you will have to follow in order to realize the goals and objectives, the type of communication media or communication opportunities that you will have to use in effecting change, the core roles that you will have to perform, the typical techniques that you will have to use, the role that the community and its members themselves will have to play in the process, and lastly, where the so-called power structure should fit into the picture. Even though the practice models would give you a menu to choose from, students and practitioners usually want to know exactly how they should go about choosing one or more. It should first be noted that your choice of practice model will not only depend on the objective findings of your community analysis, you will also have to take the policies and practices of your organization and government into consideration, as well as the views and expectations of community members and other stakeholders. It would, in the final analysis, be a case of finding the best fit, even though the result might, objectively speaking, not be the most appropriate one. The process that you should follow in this regard is explained in detail in Chapter 3 of the book. There is, however, an easy way in which you could identify which model or models would be the most appropriate ones to use when working with Medieval. This would entail that you would reformulate the first three practice variables as questions. These will be: what is the predominant view of the nature of Medieval? Where do Medieval's existing impediments come from? And who in Medieval must directly benefit from my services? If you combine your answers to these three questions, you ought to have a pretty good idea of what your services ought to entail and which practice model or combination of models to choose as your point of departure. Here are a couple of examples. If you find that Medieval is a stagnant community characterized by apathy that will have to undergo broad-based change, community development would be your obvious choice. If it is characterized by dysfunctional or needy members who do not receive the services that they require, social planning would be the best option. If community members do not have the knowledge and skills required to address the impediments they experience, community education would have to play a role. If they have negative attitudes towards social issues or do not know which services are available, social marketing should be considered. And if there are groups in the community who are the victims of faulty policies and practices, social action should come into play. However, remember, take all the role players' expectations into consideration before making a final choice, and also note that the models could be combined in various ways to meet local demands. And this brings us to our last typical question. And it is, so we've decided on a target community and impediments. What next? Once a decision has been made on a practice model or combination of models, the 9 other practice variables come into play. They will guide you on how to implement each model in practice. If you decide on community development, you will, for example, have to negotiate grassroots entry into the community in order to mobilize self-help groups that would be used to change the community members' behavior. If you decide on social planning, you will, for example, have to undertake research into the nature and extent of the community's impediments and use the results to lay claim to the resources that are required to create new services or improve existing services. In the same way, the other practice models, as structured according to the variable, would give you clear guidelines on how to implement them in practice. And there you have it. The practice models do not only indicate the types of community work services that you should deliver, but also how you should go about doing it. This is why practice models are basically defined as a set of concepts and principles that guide intervention. From my side, good luck with converting these guidelines into effective practice.